Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Varley Art Gallery's Lunch and Learn series, generously sponsored by the Varley McKay Art Foundation of Markham. I'm Alessandra. I'm the Varley's Education and Research Assistant and also your host for today's webinar. We begin today's program by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and their commitment to the stewardship of the land. We acknowledge the communities in Circle, the North, West, South, and Eastern directions, and Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Seneca, Chippewa, and the current treaty holders, Mississaugas of the Credit Peoples. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure that the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. I'd just like to point out a few things before I pass it off to our speakers. So we have auto-generated captions available at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording this talk and it will be available in about a week on our YouTube channel. The presenters will speak for about 45 minutes and then there will be a 15-minute period for audience questions at the end. So please feel free to use the Q&A section of the chat to submit your questions. Today, we have artist Sara Angelucci and curator Shannon Anderson to join us in conversation to share the current exhibition, Sara Angelucci, Undergrowth, on now until April 30th at the Varley Art Gallery of Markham. Sara Angelucci is a Toronto-based artist working in photography, video, and audio. She has exhibited her work across Canada in solo exhibitions at the Art Gallery of York University, Le Mois de Photo in Montreal, VU in Quebec City, the Toronto Photographers Workshop, the McLaren Art Center, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, the Richmond Art Gallery, and St. Mary's University Art Gallery in Halifax. Internationally, she has had solo exhibitions at the Canadian Cultural Center in Paris, the Lanzo Photo Festival, and the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art in Charleston. Her work has been featured in numerous group shows in the US, Europe, and China at the Pingyao and Beijing Biennales. She completed her BA at the University of Guelph and her MFA at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Angelucci is an adjunct professor in photography at the School of Image Arts, Metropolitan University, Toronto. She is represented by Stephen Bulger Gallery in Toronto. The artist would also like to thank the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of the work included in this exhibition. Shannon Anderson currently serves as the curator for the Art Gallery of Mississauga and has previously held the position of art curator for the Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital. As an independent curator and writer of contemporary art, she has generated exhibitions for galleries across Canada, including the Blackwood Gallery in Mississauga, the Musée d'Art de Joliette, Oakville Galleries, Plug in ICA in Winnipeg, St. Mary's University Art Gallery in Halifax, the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, and the Surrey Art Gallery, among others. She has written essays for publications produced by numerous art galleries and has contributed text to Art Papers, Azure, Border Crossing, Canadian Art, C Magazine, Carousel, Design Lines, iMazing Amsterdam, and the Globe and Mail. So without further ado, please welcome Sara Angelucci and Shannon Anderson.
Hello. Thank you, Alessandra. Hi, Sara.
Hello, Shannon.
I'm just going to give, so the way Sara and I thought we would structure this is have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to ask Sara some questions, and through that process, we're going to take you through the exhibition at the Varley specifically, talk about things sort of in a fairly straightforward chronological manner that sort of follows the way that we've installed the exhibition at the Varley. I just want to first thank the Varley for hosting this exhibition. This is a touring exhibition that sort of initiated, it's called Undergrowth. And we initially had a sort of small version of it at SPOW in Ottawa, and then it went to the Varley, or to the Art Gallery of Sudbury, and now it's at the Varley, and then it will be traveling to the Tom Thompson Gallery in Owen Sound as well, and then eventually to the Art Gallery of Mississauga, my home base. So we're really grateful to the Varley for taking on this exhibition. It's really exciting to work with the team there and to work in that space. It's a gorgeous gallery, and hopefully most of you have already, who are attending this talk, have been there in person. It's a lovely space, and we're grateful to Tony Hafkinsheed for taking some installation images already of the exhibition and sharing them We'll be incorporating them into the slideshow today. So if you haven't seen the show already, you'll get hopefully an introductory sense to what the space is like. But of course, there's nothing like being at the gallery itself and seeing the work in person. So just as sort of a rough overview, Undergrowth looks at about a 10-year span of Sara's most recent body of work. So it's not a retrospective per se, in the fact that it really stretches back over the full span of her career, but really just looks at the last certain bodies of work from the last 10 years of her practice. And we've really focused on following this thread of the relationship between people in the natural world or people in the environment in her work, and particularly how the role of photography and photographic processes play a role in that relationship between those two worlds. So that's the way the exhibition has been structured. So what I thought we'd do is sort of talk about each body of work in series and sort of in sequence, just to sort of share how these different themes shift and evolve throughout the exhibition. Did you want to say anything, Sara, just to kind of kick things off, or should we start with the first body of work?
I just want to say thanks to everyone who's out there for coming, and
Yes.
I hope you have a good lunch and, and that you will learn something. But I too am very grateful for all the collaborators I've worked with. So yeah, let's move on to look at art and talk about ideas.
All right. So you've got our screen.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, it worked when we practiced.
Yep, I can see it. There we go.
You want to see this though. So hang on a sec.
Yep.
Let's get that all set up. So hopefully you're just seeing the talk.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Intro page. Perfect. So, and I haven't seen this slideshow before, so this is exciting. I might have a couple of moments of like, wow, this is right off the bat. This is really great. So the first series that you see is, if we're sort of tracking the exhibition from one end to the other, is Aviary, which is the earliest series in the exhibition from 2013. And I think it's sort of, a real starting point for talking about these issues of people's relationship to the natural world. And also, using through the medium of photographic processes and how things have been photographed. So I wondered if you could, and I know that the beginning of this body of work, there was a real strong catalyst for starting to develop this series. So I was wondering if you could share that story with people.
Absolutely. So I think artistic process is very interesting for the audience, because you don't often get behind the scenes in people's thinking and seeing all the trial and error that goes into making a body of work. And a lot of times the ideas are quite tangential at the beginning, and then they sort of fled together. So I want to start with this image of, these are carte de visite, which are 19th century portrait photographs that I collected on eBay. And I've always been very interested in archival or vernacular, let's say, photographs. I'm very interested in this idea of memory and disappearance, this idea that these people were once someone's loved ones, and then when they become unmoored from their origins, they are disconnected and no longer have any kind of identity. And I would like to read you something that in a sort of some quotes from Susan Sontag and John Berger that I love, that really talk about this idea. So Sontag says, unlike memory, photographs do not in themselves preserve meaning. They offer appearances. The private photograph, the portrait of a mother, a picture of a daughter, a group photo of one's team, is appreciated and read in a context which is continuous with that form from which the camera removed it. But once that contact has been taken off, then we lose, it's been severed from its context, it loses its meaning, and it really only becomes an appearance. So here I'd like to quote artist Christian Boltanski, who said something for me which has stuck with me since I heard it many, many years ago. And he said, they say that we die twice, once when we die and a second time when no one recognizes our picture. So I began to think about these lost images and these people that had lost their identities. And at the same time, this was around 2012, I was becoming increasingly aware of environmental issues, reading a lot and thinking about lost species, and birds in particular were catching my attention. And I had this very strange idea. It sort of was like off the cuff thinking about what might it mean or what might it look like to think about merging our plight with the plight of animals. And could I, in fact, create a kind of hybrid creature? So in doing so, in thinking that through, I visited the Royal Ontario Museum and got permission from Mark Peck in the ornithology collection to begin photographing and studying their ornithology collection. And here you see in this image a number of extinct and endangered birds. So the two on the right are the passenger pigeon, which were wiped out through overhunting by 1914, actually. The center bird is the curlew, and that is a heath hen on the right-hand side. So you'll see that I began to really think about that connection. And this bird, the curlew, I would say, was a kind of existential moment for me, and really feeling a connection to a creature that was so exquisite that had been, essentially wiped off the planet through our own will, over hunting and habitat destruction, which continues, that I don't know, something profoundly shifted for me. And I really began to think about that connection on a much deeper level. So this is my hybrid curlew, in which I photographed the bird 360 degrees or 180 degrees, and then began to morph it with the portrait. This was the original portrait for you to see.
It's so interesting to see the original portraits. For me, I can't look at them without thinking of the morphing at this point, because I'm so familiar with those faces, but seen in that shifted way.
And just to finish off that thought, Shannon, the more research I did in this period, both in terms of the history of photography and its sort of colonizing role, I also began to understand the colonizing role of the British Empire, for example, which ruled a quarter of the world's land and a fifth of its population at the time, and the way that hunting, gathering, specimen collection, all of these things began to be part of the predominant culture. And so that this way that we used plants and animals for our own benefit really became part of this kind of everyday. So just showing you a couple of images from the ornithology lab so you can get a sense of the number of specimens that they have there for study. And I'll just also show you a couple of images of birds that were in bird vitrines. These are 19th century bird vitrines, and these are the kinds of things that people would have in their homes, in their parlors from this period.
Those are great.
So
and
here's
it was quite a process, right? To that morphing process and all the images you took. I think when I first knew about the series, I didn't really understand how complex the process was to achieving this likeness.
It is. I mean, I don't want to Photoshop geek out here. Any of you that do that will understand, but it's painstaking layering and blending that goes, you can't just sort of like take a picture of a bird and plonk it on top. It just wouldn't look correct. So the kinds of things that I paid a lot of attention to were the shapes of the faces. The direction of the beak had to be absolutely correct, or I couldn't make it sit convincingly on the face. The other thing that began to happen is, this series really began with thinking about humans and people that had lost their moorings. And I started then, after a period of time, to think about, yes, but which person deserves to be this bird? I began to become so connected in the research on the birds and their plight that relationship shifted, that the human was no longer my major area of concern. And I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of thinking about an existential shift in my thinking, was that the more I learned about the plight of the birds, the more I began to realize our involvement, our responsibility, and to understand that our connection and empathy with these creatures is really what's at stake in terms of saving them and saving us.
That's gorgeous. Do you have any images of the series in situ in the Varley in your slideshow?
I do not,
Oh,
but
that's okay.
yeah, there is a virtual exhibition online that
Yeah.
They've put together, which is stunning. So you can fly through the exhibition.
Perfect. Yeah, I can't wait to. That'll be great. Was there anything else you want to say about that series before we?
I think I could talk about this series for hours.
I know.
So maybe we just, keep flowing those ideas forward.
Well, every time you talk about one of these bodies of work, I learn something new, and even just to see all these images, it's really, yeah, you can go pretty deep pretty quickly. It's great. Okay, so we'll shift over to the sightings piece. Great. And so this is one, even though we've shown this exhibition in a couple of other locations previously, we haven't been able to show this piece yet because it's quite tall, quite high. And not all galleries can kind of accommodate the scale. So as you can see, it's a series of stacked sewing machines with a woodpecker on top. And you can maybe we can talk about the process behind how it came together. But it looks beautiful in the space, and it's situated with the aviary series in one room and an arboretum. So these three works all kind of speak in conversation. And there are a lot of connections, obviously, even though we're talking about these pieces, one series at a time. I mean, we could have a whole other discussion about the interconnections happening between them. Most obviously in this one, obviously, is the bird and the species being a focus, and the story of that particular species is really focusing on one bird in this image. And so, but there's also, there's a historical content in this piece, but then also personal elements as well. And I think that carries through in a lot of the series that we'll be looking at today, that there's a real intermingling between history in general and then personal relevance as well. So I wondered if you could maybe talk about how both of those elements come together in this particular piece.
Absolutely. So extending from the aviary series, I created this piece called Sightings, I Rebuild Woodpecker. And sightings, if you get into bird watching or reading about bird watching, it's always sighting, and then they describe like where the bird has been seen. And people get very excited, like, a Canada warbler on the steps of, the library or something like that. And they post these sightings. So this bird, the ivory-billed woodpecker, was last sighted in the 40s in a forest, in a wet forest, swampy forest in Louisiana, which was the natural habitat of the bird. And the land that it was on was known as the Singer Tract. And the Singer Sewing Machine Company, so I'll go back to the other image so you can see the different models of Singer sewing machines. The Singer Sewing Machine Company at the turn of the century was one of the biggest foresters of primary first growth wood and forests in North America, because they were manufacturing thousands and thousands and thousands of wooden cabinets for their machines. And there was a huge demand for sewing machines at this time, and it kept growing. And so they would buy up gigantic tracts of forest, and this piece of forest where this bird lived was 80,000 acres. And eventually Singer sold the land to a logging company. They completely deforested it and turned it into soybean crops. So as a result, this bird, the last place that it had been seen, it went extinct. So to create this sculpture, I sourced locally just through eBay and Kijiji. That was a great source. A range of models, and of course, I wanted to make a tree essentially. So I wanted it to continue to go up. And the last one is a portable model. The bird itself is an exact replica of the ivory-billed woodpecker that's in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum. So we used 3D modeling to photograph the bird 360 degrees in extreme detail. And then this is digitally printed. So it's actually a ceramic 3D print. So in essence, it's a photograph, which is a strange thing to say, but it's a photographic technology that created this bird. So to the personal note, Shannon referred to, my mother was a seamstress, and that second machine up was my mother's actual sewing machine that I've kept for many years. And sewing and this idea of women's labor is a theme that comes up through numerous projects, and I'll refer to something later. But it is something that really interests me. Yeah.
Nice. And so I think, as I mentioned, there's the aviary series, there's this sightings piece, and then we also have the Arboretum series that kind of make up that room in the gallery. So I don't know if you want to move to the Arboretum image.
I can do that.
If you're ready to do that, unless there's something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
You want to address.
So just to show you some of the photographs that I've purchased at flea markets, garage sales, on eBay. I have quite a collection of vernacular photographs. Some are snapshots, some are done in studios. And so just continuing that in the Arboretum series, which I'll show you next, I began to really think and study more the idea of the plight of birds and our involvement in that, and the history of photography's involvement of that. And one of the things I started noticing when I was purchasing these photographs is that a common factor was in a studio portrait was to have a painted backdrop. And often these painted backdrops were some kind of natural scene or forest scene, trees, gardens. And so I started to think about the sort of pictorial tradition of landscape painting, which of course photography borrows from. And to think about the way that we frame ourselves, nature becomes this sort of backdrop and we are the center, right? And although this is only, I want to say, a sort of pictorial idea, it's more than a pictorial idea. It starts to become, and it is in fact, this idea that we are dominant, that we control nature, that we're above nature, that we are, the top predator. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do via aviary, but also through Arboretum, and this is one of the images from the series of Arboretum, is to start to think about how do we rebalance that relationship. So I'm working at it visually by photographing trees in Ontario and layering and creating images in which the figure blends with the background and has a sort of secondary place. But it's also something I'm thinking about ecologically. I'm thinking about it in terms of how we live, how we garden, how everything that we do. So it's really permeating all my thinking. So
in the area, the landscapes that you're using in these works that you're bringing in, if I remember right, are from the area around the Niagara Escarpment where you have your cottage space. Is that right?
Yes, we have a small cottage in the Pretty River Valley, and the area around us is protected provincial land. So as a result, it's, treed and wild, and our property is very wild. We purposely don't really garden it. We sort of let it be what it is. And so that's where I've been getting a lot of resource material, trees, and you'll see from the next series that I show, Nocturnal Botanical, that a lot of source material comes from there.
Terrific. And so just before we go to Nocturnal Botanical, I thought maybe we'd talk about the center room of the gallery, where again, there's a couple of different bodies of work shown together. There's a selection of work from a series called Black Flowers, and also Twirl of a Butterfly's Tongue. And those two series are connected in their use of a similar source material, and both looking at lantern slides. So again, another kind of shift in historical photographic processes. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about both of those in relationship to what brought you to using lantern slides, maybe, and also how you use them in those two bodies of work.
Absolutely. So lantern slides, I discovered a collection of lantern slides at a place called the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester. And many of you may know that Rochester is the home of Kodak. George Eastman created Kodak, and George Eastman House is there. So the city of Rochester has a very strong connection to photographic production and history. Visual Studies Workshop is a really interesting place that supports the work of artists. They see their collections as working collections. So unlike a lot of archives where you have to put on white gloves and see one thing at a time and somebody hovers over you, in the Visual Studies Workshop lantern slide collection, I was given free rein to come and go as I pleased. And so I became fascinated by their collection. I'll show you another close-up. And then I'll go back of their science collection. They had a discarded science collection from the Buffalo Science Museum. Lantern slides were used primarily for educational purposes. You can see they're about 3 by 4 inches. They're glass. Most of them are black and white. Some of them are colored, but the coloring is hand painted. And so, of course, they would do everything like, cover ethnography, if you will. So this one says Italy, Rome, typical crowd of Italians, which I love, of course, because I'm Italian, in front of the Fountain of the Tortoises. So this was taken in the 1920s. So they would do these sort of, ethnographic or travel lectures where a speaker could come and take you on a journey around the world. But they were also used, as I said, for educational purposes. So the collection that I delved into had a whole range of topics from, star charts, weather, botany, insects, birds. They were a whole range of subjects. So I became just enraptured by these slides. I traveled there on 4 different occasions, and I made thousands of images. And eventually I began to work in the botanical collection. And this series is called Black Flowers, as Shannon mentioned. And what I was thinking about at the time, which was kind of a surprise to me, that my sister had passed away about 2 years before I was working in this collection. And I guess just spending so much time there alone working, I was there for hours on end. I found myself thinking of her a lot and writing in a journal. And it sort of crept up on me. And I think grief does that. And so what I found myself doing, as I said, sort of unbeknownst to me, was creating these floral bouquets. And then I began to really think about this idea of creating them as mourning bouquets, and thinking about the history of Victorian mourning. And, these slides refer back to that as well. So I created a whole body of work called Black Flowers in ode to her. But in addition to that, years passed, and I kept revisiting this collection of lantern slides. and found that there were just such fascinating and very beautiful images in the collection. And I want to point out before I talk about the film that lantern slides were hand painted, and many of them were done by women working in factories, the same as you might see women working in ceramic factories. That tradition sort of continued in lantern slide factories. So again, I love this idea of thinking about labor that's particular to women. Anyway, thinking about that, I decided at a certain point, and we've put a link in the window so you can watch the film. It's 5 minutes long, called A Twirl of a Butterfly's Tongue. And so I ended up spending weeks and weeks and weeks filtering through the lantern slides that I had photographed and thinking about how to make a film with this collection. And I soon began to realize that there was an arc to what I was seeing. And that arc, and I guess it's just the way I think about photography and lenses, but the arc of the film for me had so much to do with the way that we as humans consume the natural world, or view the natural world, or try to understand the natural world. And so you can begin to see everything at the beginning. We sort of start with these microscopic images, and then we go to X-ray images, and then we end with telescopic images. And then there's all kinds of images in between that are going to where nature, where the natural world is. So traveling to exotic places, or looking for exotic species, or trying to control nature. We see, images of the beekeeper. We see images of the man who's grafting fruit trees. So it's always about this interrelationship with the natural world. So the film really, really shows that arc.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the one body of work is really focused on these bouquets and the floral elements, and that you've been able to go back and show really the range of the photographs through the videos. They make a really lovely pairing. And again, for us, traveling with this show, this is the first time that we've been able to see the video in dialogue with the photographic work. So it's a real pleasure to have a room that's sort of dedicated to both those things together. And so I thought maybe we'll just talk a bit more about the process of putting together the video, because it has a real, I think a couple of the things that really struck me in watching it was the pacing of the video, and also the sound element, which is really, quite a significant part of the video for me.
Yeah, so if you're at home, go to the chat window. You can hit the link to Butterfly video. Maybe you can watch it for a second while I talk about it. What I began to discover when I was putting the various images in order was that I had photographed many of the same things over time, slightly differently. And so let's say I put, the beekeeper in a folder to look at those images of the beekeeper. When I ran them really quickly, one after another, they created an animation. And of course, I had never planned to do that. But, as I ran those stills, that's what started to happen. And the same with this one man. He was a little figure of an explorer, and he was on a snowy background. A snowy background, when you layer it on top of something else, it's clear. So I could layer that little, explorer man on all kinds of surfaces. And so he's fun. He's one of my favorite characters in the film, because when I scrolled through him really quickly, he was like traveling through the moon. He was traveling through fields. He was traveling through flowers. He was traveling through all kinds of things. And then sometimes I would the film's called The Twirl of a Butterfly's Tongue, because on one of the lantern slides, it says that. And I didn't realize microscopically that a butterfly's tongue is a spiral. So if I took that lantern slide and I rotated it every time, it was in the order of the film, it would sort of do this like little spiral turn. So we really I worked with this wonderful colleague, Laura Ramsey, and we really began to have fun thinking about, not only how to put these in an order that made sense in terms of a kind of investigation of the subject, but visually how to have it be fun as well. And the speed, some people have complained that it's too fast, but there's so much repetition of imagery that you do get to see everything at least a number of times. And I think it's, it's a real celebration of nature. I mean, in its richness and its beauty. It's the soundtrack was written by my very dear friend, Philip Strom. And we had planned to write a 5-minute piece, but we got to 2 minutes, and unfortunately Phil suddenly passed in December, which was very tragic. So I've dedicated the film to Phil, and I decided not to rewrite the soundtrack. I thought I'm just going to repeat it 2 times over and just keep what we have. So I'm really quite delighted with this film, and I hope everyone will have a chance to watch it.
It has a beautiful momentum. I personally find that pace really satisfying. Like, it's really hard to stop watching that video. I get really sucked into it every time, and the music is really really holds you there as well. And it's just that sort of continuous pace, right? That you really get a sense of the full weight of all of these images. There's so much, and there's so much but it also has a celebratory feel to it. So yeah,
well, I had to edit down. There were 300,000 lantern slides in the collection.
It's incredible. So many images, right? The archives are just so expansive.
They are.
The one thing we didn't really talk about yet, maybe we can sort of address it as we shift from this body of work to Nocturnal Botanical Ontario, is this notion of mourning that you touched on earlier, because it is one of, like, we have this major thread that kind of runs through the work in Undergrowth, but then there's these other not secondary but smaller threads that appear and reappear, and I think one of them is the notion of mourning, and it comes through in aviary, I think, very clearly in terms of species extinction, and then it also comes through in black flowers, obviously, with mourning bouquets, and that's both very personal and also speaking on a broader scale of mourning, and there's a shift. And from what I understand, from going from black flowers into Nocturnal Botanical Ontario, that theme of mourning continues in this work as well, in terms of working through things personally, and also turning to your immediate natural environment, so shifting from these photographic images of flowers and plant life to your actual immediate environment in the physical. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about the shift to Nocturnal Botanical Ontario and how that really came about.
Yeah, I will. And what's funny, Shannon, I mean, one of the great things about working with a curator is that they make those links that you don't think exist. Like we just, as an artist, we get so deep into the one thing that we're focused on. Doing an exhibition like this is so wonderful because you begin to go, oh yeah, like I was thinking about that 5 years ago, and there is a thread of that here that continues, right? And it makes the looking for me, and I hope for the audience, so much richer to see that there's this continuity of thought. But to answer what you were just saying, as I mentioned earlier, my sister passed away in 2015, and it was a tragic death. So that made it much harder for all of us. It was unexpected. And I found myself in, and I'm sure many people feel this way, you find yourself in this state of grief, and it's a strange state. It sort of sneaks up on you. You don't really know what to do with it or how to handle it. It's quite lonely, actually. And so I found myself just one summer deciding that I couldn't make art at all, even though I felt I needed to and wanted to. I just couldn't find a way to do it, to express those ideas artistically. And I just started gardening and just being in my garden and finding this place of quiet and solace. And then I said to myself, oh, maybe I could just scan the plants there as a way of getting to know them. And I sort of was like sneaking into making art, like not telling myself it was a project because I didn't know what I was doing, but as a way to kind of just, as I said, just learn about what plants were growing. And in that process, it was so interesting. I realized that I had this small city garden. By the end, I had named 50 plants in this tiny little plot that was probably 10 by 10 feet. And some I had planted, of course, but some just appeared and I didn't know what they were. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So eventually, to make a long story short, I started scanning in Allen Gardens in a greenhouse, and the light was so bright that it just blasted my scanner and it distorted the colors. And I didn't really know why I was there and why I would be interested in those particular plants. It wasn't making sense. So scanning at night outdoors and going in situ was a kind of reaction to the greenhouse. It was the opposite. I was saying, rather than going somewhere where there are exotic plants and where the light is so bright and out of my control, what would it be like to scan where the plants grow together, and to understand what grows around me, and to isolate the plants using darkness. So that's really how this series evolved. It became a project that grew out of grief. And I would say that perhaps what's intermingling now is this idea of environmental grief that we read a lot about, and personal grief. But I think that I would say that, when you allow yourself to open that channel, it allows you to connect with so many other things emotionally. So that allowing myself to grieve for my sister allowed me to also see what was happening around me with clearer eyes, I would say.
And so for people who aren't already familiar with the series, as you're saying, you photograph these at night in your immediate vicinity, and you're working with a scanner. And then there's one of my favorite things about the series, especially when you can see them up close, because they are quite big. So maybe we can talk about the scale, but also you find these little moments where there's a little, what I would call maybe a digital disruption, like there's a little shift in the image. So maybe that you've kept, and you wouldn't have to keep that necessarily. So I'm curious about if you can talk a bit about how those shifts even happen, like up in the top there of that particular image is a good example, as you can see the stem shifts. And that's I guess it's an error, but it's very much a desired visual outcome. So maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Well, I sort of feel like I sort of feel like these are the opposite of aviary. Maybe I just got so tied up with the digital and Photoshop in that series that it kind of burned me out. I'd spent so many hours, and now I'm outdoors. So it's the opposite of sitting at a computer.
Yeah.
And so I'm loosening up. I'm basically allowing what happens to happen. And so this, that glitch happens because the wind blew and the scanner can't register movement. And so I like that it reveals the process. If you pay attention to the images, you can begin to see how they're made. And you can begin to understand that too a little bit by how shallow the depth of field is of what the scanner can focus. Really, it can only focus a couple of inches away. So anything that's touching the surface is sharp, but after that, it starts to become less and less in focus. So that it interests me in any medium, I would say, that I'm playing in, is to really think about the process itself and what it can and cannot do, and kind of just to embrace that. So just to extend that, because I'm working at night and because I'm outdoors, insects appear too. So on this one, you can see a moth that's landed on the surface. And then sometimes you see these little zigzaggy marks, and that's because they're insects, usually mosquitoes or something, that are zipping through the composition that, again, the scanner can't register. Because, a photograph is like 125th of a second and it's one image. A scan takes place over time, and it's generally about 3 minutes. So lots of things can happen in that space of time over a surface area.
It really gives you a sense that these are there's this allusion to something being very much alive, right?
Mhm.
It's not necessarily a still life of a, traditional bouquet. There's things are still growing, things are still moving and out of your control.
Totally.
It's a beautiful like detail in the work that really resonates on a lot of levels.
Yeah,
And so,
this is a good example. Sorry, Shannon.
yes,
Just
no,
to jump,
no, that's fine.
you can
Yeah.
see here the moth, it landed, and then the scanner sort of got part of its body, and then it flew up and it landed again. It got part of its body, and then finally at the top, it landed and stayed.
Hmm.
So again, this is more cinematic. A scan is like a little film unfolding over time. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. And the series has grown a lot over the years. I mean, we started working on this. I think when we started developing this project, this was a fairly new series, and it's been really interesting for me to watch you delve ever deeper into the process. Getting a generator, so even like on a practical level, so you can start exploring other places. Like we didn't really talk about how this, you were tethered to your home in an extension cord at first, and now you're really starting to venture out into the dark and experiment with different ways of generating this work. There's that growth, but then there's also the growth of as you're learning about these plants too, because I mean what we don't see here is that with the titles you identify most of what we're seeing in the images, which I think is probably a challenge sometimes to determine, but a really interesting element of the project.
It totally is. And, speaking of expanding my range,
I wondered if you were going to have an image of this. I'm not sure if I should ask about it. Yeah. We should talk about that too.
Yeah. I'm starting to be able to scan further afield. So these are all water plants. And and I'm really interested in what are native plants, what are introduced plants, what are invasive species, how they're competing for territory. So the cardinal flower, the red one, is actually a native plant that grows along waterways. It likes rivers. I've been dreaming this year about taking my generator into my kayak.
Oh, wow.
I think that would
have a Tom Thompson moment.
Yeah, because when I'm kayaking, I see plants I don't see anywhere else. So
Right.
I'm really fascinated with expanding that. But this has the Joe Pye weed and also mint. That flowering plant in the lower bottom corner is mint, which grows along water too. It's wild mint. So and yeah, the scale of this. So this is the first time we've made anything this large. This is wallpaper, which is strippable and recyclable. So I was very excited to experiment with it. And the scale is really important to this work because I was reading this amazing article called Plant Blindness. And the thing is that we ignore plants unless you're a gardener, or a plant lover. Most people just sort of like walk past. And I was one of those people until I started really digging in and paying attention. And I think when you shift scale, it forces you to look and pay attention and see the forms and begin to question and ask, why are the seed pods that shape? I mean, everything in nature has a sort of practical purpose, right? So, why are they shaped that way? And why do these things grow next to one another? How do they support one another's growth, or are they competing with one another? These two plants were growing right next to each other in every case. I'm also really interested in how the plants transform over the seasons. Like this is milkweed in bloom, and then which happens around June, and then this is milkweed in the fall. So for me, the seed pods, I mean, everyone says, oh, you're doing these flowers. And I'm like, I'm not doing flowers, I'm doing plants.
Yeah.
And I'm just as interested in the seeds as I am in what happens to the flowering part of the plant. That's just one part of the cycle.
And the decay as well is really beautiful. Like some of the most memorable parts of these images are the things that are dying, right? And or that are falling apart in different ways. That's quite gorgeous.
Yeah, and this, I'll maybe just end with this one to say that this plant is called the bottle gentian. It's quite a rare plant. It grows along, it's becoming extinct in some parts of North America. It grows along water. So I found this at my friend's pond. And here we have the Queen Anne's lace, which is an invasive species. It was an introduced species. that's now going into seed, and the seed pod is extraordinary. So again, it's just, for me, there's just sort of endless looking and studying that's happening in this work that I'm really, really still embedded in.
Yes, and the series is continuing, right? It's not, it
Yes.
hasn't come to an end yet.
No,
So
I'm not tired of it yet.
good.
Other people might be, but I'm not.
I'm not. I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes next.
Thanks.
So before I think that's kind of the end of the question. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring
Yeah.
forward before we go to questions?
I mean, there's so much reading and research I'm doing these days, and I want to acknowledge a book that many of you, I'm sure, have read, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. I read this book about 3 years ago. I think I'm my third time through. I mean, it's so rich. For those of you who don't know her, she is an Indigenous botanist, but she's also a Western trained scientist, botanist. So what she compares these two sort of worldviews through her writing. And I just really love to share something that she says that I think as Westerners, we really need to think about. And that is that in the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings, with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plants at the bottom. But in Native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus have the most to learn. We must look to our teachers, amongst other species, for guidance. And then she ends with, plants know how to make food and medicine from light and water, and then they give it away. So I'll end with that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
My pleasure. So I guess I'll stop share and yeah, see if there's any questions from the people out there.
The people we can't see who are out there.
So there is a question about the kind of scanner that you were using for that last body of work, and maybe even why there was an inclination to use a scanner rather than a camera.
It's an Epson photo scanner, so it's not crazy super expensive. I think it's around $500 or something. So that's what it is. I don't know. I think when I started using the scanner, it was because I wanted to do something very simple in my office. At home, I was going from my garden to my office and cutting plants, and it just seemed easy, as a really easy way to get an excellent exact replica. So it was almost like a scientific moment, you know. I wasn't trying to make art or make beautiful pictures. I was just really trying to study the plants. So I think once I started doing that, I started to see its potential, the potential of what the scanner can do. And I became very curious about it as a photographic technology. So it kind of just really evolved. I mean, I do have a really beautiful camera, and you know, I may end up using that in this project at some point too. But yeah, it really kind of just evolved.
Someone else asks, have you ever thought of scanning in the winter?
Well, there are practical reasons why you can't do that. The scanner is tethered to a laptop, and weather and cold temperatures are things they do not like. And I've pushed it, like I did the milkweed in October, and I was starting to get condensation because of the coldness. You can see it on some of them when I have a cold night. So there are limits to the technology in terms of working outdoors in the winter. In the winter, you know, I would get a lot of dead, dried things, which I could cut and bring indoors. But I think for me, it's wanting to work with things that are still living and shifting, decomposing.
Did the experience of working in the dark at night do anything to the way you think about capturing imagery?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I appreciate it a lot because it's really kind of amazing. First of all, every time I have to go out and do it, I think, oh no, I'm too tired, because I have to go out quite late. But once I'm all set up and I'm in the zone of doing it, it is so quiet and amazing. And I just hear all these insects. The sounds at night are very different. In fact, I think that's something I need to think about, is recording those sounds. But it's really kind of magical. And I've had encounters with all kinds of creatures at night. Like, I mean, I had a hawk flying over my head. I think I must have been in its territory, and it kept like dive bombing me. And then I had an encounter with a skunk and raccoon and a mouse that ran across my foot. So there's this sense of being, you have to get enclosed in yourself, because you can't see. I have to operate with a flashlight, and I'm in the forest, or I'm in a field, or it's very, very dark. So I have to navigate differently. And I find that really interesting. I think it makes you really internalize.
There's an earlier question, I think in reference to the aviary series. So the morphing in that bodies of work, the kind of splicing of the photographs, was done digitally or in the darkroom? Just clarification.
Oh, it was done digitally.
Somebody else, also in reference to aviary, says they are reminded of Raphael Goldchain's work in I Am My Family.
Well, that's interesting, because his is the opposite of digital. I know Raphael very well. He's a friend, and that was done in makeup, layers and layers of incredible makeup. So yeah, that was pretty phenomenal what they did with those pictures. I can understand why people would make that connection, because of the shift in appearance and all the details that go into making that difference. But there's some great videos. I think there's actually a film of Raphael in the process of creating these characters from these photographs.
Oh,
Yeah, it's really amazing.
cool. Somebody else wants to know if you could talk a bit more about your thoughts on women's work and labor throughout the pieces.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it's always one of those areas you think, I want to spend more time working on this, or thinking about this, or researching about this. There could potentially be a project in this. When I was in visual studies workshop, I had a discussion with the curator, and she was very interested in selecting slides out of the collection where a woman had been credited. So now and then you see someone's name actually on the lantern slide. And so what would happen is during this period, and I would say this is the early 20th century, so the 20s and 30s and 40s, there would be travel lectures that were given. And so some, man would travel all over the world and go to Egypt and whatever, all these exotic places, and come back and give these travel log talks, and thousands of people would attend them. And so there was this sort of competition between these speakers, and to make their slides better, they would hire someone to hand color them. And so there were these women who became very famous for their skill at hand coloring these lantern slides. But the women who worked in these factories, in these mass manufacturing of them, did not get credited for their labor. They were just sort of seen as part of the assembly line. I'm going to color in the green on this tree and the blue on the water and that sort of thing. So I sort of feel I have this ongoing interest in this idea that women, a lot of the labor that women have done over the centuries is hidden. It's behind the scenes. And I thought about this in terms of a project I did in Hamilton with my mother, working at a factory where she was a seamstress in a factory that made men's business suits, right? So we see the men in the suits, they're up front, they are the ones that are presented. Meanwhile, the labor behind this work is never seen and is rarely acknowledged. So I think it's just something I think about, is like, where is women's labor? I think in a way, mourning is women's labor, much more than it traditionally has ever been I don't mean that men don't mourn, but I think in terms of the public face of mourning, that has often been the role of women.
That's so fascinating. Oh, I think that's all the questions we have. So, and it is 12:30. So thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts, and sharing your beautiful work. As I said before, this talk will be on the Varley Art Gallery's YouTube channel, in about a week. And so I'd just like to thank you both, and we can wrap up.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
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 Shannon.
Bye.